Welcome to Focus 54, your guide to real African stories and, of course, the in-depth analysis of stories that are shaping the future of Africa. I am Jerome Peresu, and today we focus on the landmark decision that was made at the 38th African Union Summit and, of course, the adoption of the AU, a convention to ending gender-based violence on women and girls. What does this mean for the African continent? Is this just a policy on paper, or is it real decisions that are taking place? We will, of course, unpack all these with our expert guests, case studies, and more. But before we get into the second segment of that discussion, we kick off first with stories that are trending on the African continent. Now, African leaders, rather, have created a fund to provide cheaper debt. Beset by debt and billions of dollars in unfunded priorities, African leaders have approved a fund to provide concessionary lending to cash-strapped governments. The facility, known as the African Financial Stability Mechanism, will be managed by the African Development Bank, the AFDB. We then take a look now at Egypt, where as Egypt builds support for counter-plan for Gaza's reconstruction, Cairo's plan, which has been presented to Arab countries and European diplomats in a response that of the US, which aims to remove Gaza's 2 million people with no right of return to pave way for reconstruction. Now in Sudan, the UN has issued alarm of a surge in human rights abuses in Sudan. And that report on Sudan issued by the UN Human Rights Office said the continued and deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian objects, as well as summary executions, sexual violations, and other violations and abuses. And finally, we will look at the pressing issue in South Africa, where the US top diplomats have reported that they will boycott the G20 foreign ministers meeting in South Africa. Amid tensions between Washington and Pretoria, Marco Rubio has criticized the country's policies as anti-American. Well, that's all we have for you in this segment, but do stay with us as we delve deeper into their story that is leading the headlines. Welcome back to the second segment, and I'm joined in the studio by a distinguished guest, the Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, Virginia Mwanigwa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jerome. It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you.
Now, for starters, may you give us a brief background of the AU Convention on Ending Gender-Based Violence Against Men and Girls?
So the AU Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls is meant to ramp up Africa's response to the issue of gender-based violence, but focusing specifically on the violence that is perpetrated against women and girls. And this is because of evidence that shows us that women and girls are the majority that actually face gender-based violence. So the convention is building upon the Maputo Protocol, which was looking at women's rights in general, and the convention now is specifically highlighting what is to be done around the issue of violence against women and girls. It is a result of a long process of negotiations where the different member states of the AU come together and talk about the issue of violence against women and girls and what needs to be done about it. So the convention is a stronger instrument that is going to enable member states, if they are willing, to address the problem. Yeah.
Obviously, given that the new constitution builds upon that Maputo Protocol, how can it, in what ways will it enhance Africa's legal framework?
It will enhance Africa's legal framework in terms of being a bit more clearer on the specific issues in the area of violence against women and girls. So looking at violence in public, in private and cyber spaces, and also looking at violence that is perpetrated against different groups of women and girls, and also addressing emerging challenges in the world of work. Also looking at groups like violence against elderly women, violence against women that are deemed to be stateless, that are seeking asylum, and also violence against women with disabilities. So what it does is it provides yet another map or roadmap or guide on how institutions can address these problems.
Now, drawing from what you've just said, you as the Commission, how are you going to implement some of these strategies in our nation, Zimbabwe?
So as a Commission, we do not implement, but I would want to say as Zimbabwe, we are ahead of other countries, among a few other countries that have commissions, because a commission by its nature's role is to monitor implementation of constitutional obligations. So as a commission, we are already in place, and what we've been doing is monitoring the extent to which Zimbabwe as a country is also being accountable to some of the instruments like this particular convention that we have signed in the past, to our own constitution as a country, and then to also our own national gender policy, among other policies that seek to address key issues around gender and women's empowerment.
Now, obviously, with the recent 38th summit that was held there, what lessons can be learned from other nations in terms of implementation?
There are always a lot of lessons, and these lessons may not necessarily come out during this particular session where the convention was adopted, because that session is a culmination of negotiations, like I said, among the different countries, which we know are not homogeneous, because the countries across the continent are different in terms of culture, in terms of some of our values. And so what the session basically did was to get to a point of consensus. And I guess the challenge usually with consensus among a lot of people is that in some cases you sign in so that you have a win-win situation. But implementation may then become a challenge if you sign up to something maybe that in principle you are not agreed to. But signing a convention as a country, as a member state, means that you are committed at least to the main principles that that convention is about. And so in Zimbabwe, we have signed up, we already committed, we had already adopted our own even domestic instruments to deal with gender-based violence, to deal with domestic violence. So it is not a problem for us to be able to implement it. The only challenge, if we're looking at Africa, because this is a program that's looking at Africa, is that we may then have different rates of implementation of the convention based on whether culturally the country signs up to what the convention requires. And sometimes it's also the issue of whether they have a coordinating mechanism, which in Zimbabwe we have, because we have a national gender machinery, which is led by the Ministry of Women Affairs, SMEs, Community Development, and SMEs. So lessons are there, but I believe that as a country, we're actually providing some of the lessons to other countries on what needs to be done.
Maybe delving deeper into what you've just said now, what are some of the practical implementations that you've undertaken? Okay,
so the practical implementation that Zimbabwe has undertaken is that we have a very progressive constitution, which also aligns, or actually, because the constitution is the supreme law of the land, so it actually says what it is that we sign up to as a country. And we've already said that as a country, we guarantee protection from violence against women, from gender-based violence, specifically also violence against women and girls. So we've also set up a structure that is meant to ensure that as a country, our response to issues of gender are coordinated, they are effective, and they are also comprehensive. So through the National Gender Machinery that I spoke about, which brings together government departments, the ministries, the departments, the agents, commissions, civil society organizations, the media, private sector and other players to ensure that as a country we're implementing instruments that we've signed up to. And then we also as a country engaged through the National Gender Machinery in a serious awareness raising and conscientizing process of getting our people to understand what the Constitution says on different issues. The issues around personal security included, the issues around violence against women and girls also included.
Are we doing enough of that?
You know, when we're talking about social work or social processes, you can never say it's enough, because even as we are doing the work that we are doing, other issues emerge that we then have to tackle. You know, earlier on I spoke about cyber or violence in the cyberspace. The cyberspace is a good space, but it's a double-edged knife. It's a good space because it allows us to be able to communicate and speak and put our messages across. But on the other hand, it also gives those that have propensity to perpetrate violence against others an avenue to be able to also start violating others through the cyberspace. So this is an area that obviously now we have to strengthen as a country. We have to strengthen as Africa to be able to deal with gender-based violence, violence against women and girls that is perpetrated in the cyberspace. We also having this program and the adoption of this convention just after the ILO has adopted the convention, the ILO convention on ending violence and harassment in the world of work. That obviously brings in a new aspect where, yes, we've always been talking about ensuring that our workplaces are safe, they don't have violence, they don't have harassment. But this is an emerging issue that we now need to tackle using that particular convention, which provides us with the strategies to be able to deal with the issues. Right. We are also looking at even issues of I already talked about statelessness. I think we are seeing different changes globally and also within our own continent that bring in the need for us to be able to be well placed as a country and also as a continent to deal with ensuring that there's no violence against women and girls that find themselves stateless.
I can see there's a lot of work that you are implementing on the ground there.
As a country,
as
yes.
a country, that's so true. Accountability issues, mechanisms that should be established to ensure that African governments, including Zimbabwe, effectively implement the provisions of all these. How is this being done?
So the convention itself highlights the issue of accountability, and it also puts in place mechanisms that accountability will be tracked. The countries or the member states are expected to report within a year after they've actually ratified the convention, to start reporting on what they are doing a year after they've ratified this convention, and then to report every 2 years after that. So this creates an accountability mechanism where the country not only has to track its own progress according to its plans, but also has to realize that it's competing with other countries in terms of actually making the letter and spirit of the convention alive. It also, on the issue of accountability, the convention itself has also outlined the need for countries, like I said earlier, to have coordinated, effective, and also culturally sensitive approaches to the implementation of the convention.
That's correct. Now, just going further in terms of bringing awareness, what role can the media play to bring about that much needed awareness?
The role is a very important part where the media, because of its role in educating, in informing the public, is well placed to amplify the message on one, what is this convention? how does it relate to those issues that they've already been reporting about?
I'll have to hold your thoughts there. I know it's
Okay.
getting a bit exciting, but we need to take a break. We will take a short break, but do stay with us. Welcome back to the third and final segment of Focus 54. Now, we focus now on social, cultural, and institutional impact of the convention. How can this convention help shift deeply into societal norms and perpetuate GBV in Africa?
Yeah, maybe to say a bit more about our expectation of the role that the media can play in not only amplifying the reach of people to know what this convention is about, but also to start analyzing some of the issues that the convention is dealing with. So the media can help us to, because the media is a key player in terms of being opinion leaders on social, economic, and cultural issues.
Correct.
So this convention is going to help us as people. And let me just delve back a bit and say, we're talking about Africa, issues for Africa. And Africa is made up of different member states, of which Zimbabwe is one.
Yes.
And then Zimbabwe is made up of its people, individually and collectively. And these people have different cultural beliefs, different structural issues that they believe in, norms and standards that we live by as people. So as we go forward, now that we have the convention, what the convention will do is help us to mediate some of those cultural beliefs, some of which may even seem to be supporting violence against women and girls. So when we have the convention and we're looking at what it says, we're able to look at the convention, look at our own cultural practices as a people, and say, what is it that we need to stop? So the convention is going to help us to actually review our own belief systems, our own customs, our own practices as people. But I need to also clarify, because sometimes when people hear about a convention, that's not, that's from the continent or global, then there's a tendency to think that this is a foreign document that has nothing to do with us. Zimbabwe has been part of the process towards the convention. African states have been actually coming together and speaking and negotiating around those sensitive issues culturally. So much so that by the time that the convention was adopted, those issues have been addressed. So in principle now the convention is outlawing violence against women and girls and is starting to say how we can do this. So this is part of what the convention will do to address the issues of the economic, the social, the cultural, whatever norms and beliefs that are currently prevailing, not just in the continent, but in the countries, and also even at family, starting at family level.
What are some of the challenges you faced in terms of reaching out to the rural folk, for example, in Zimbabwe? We're looking at language barriers, cultural differences. What are some of the complications, the challenges that you faced?
Maybe I'll take that question in terms of the negotiations for the convention, and it's good that you talk about the language barrier. The experience that I've had when I've attended similar meetings to the one that adopted this convention, and also the negotiations before that, was that language is a very important issue. And we already have different languages, key languages in the African continent. And when it then comes to negotiation and putting meanings to different words, it becomes a challenge. So you find that, yes, we've adopted a convention, but definitely one of the challenges that we have, or that was there in the negotiations, but that will also be there when it comes to implementation, is when we really now dive down and try to unpack the words that are in the convention, and we are trying to implement them at a local level. You then find that, and this is also it's an issue, but this is already an issue even if we didn't have the language barrier. Because when we have to get consensus and agree on a convention, it means we are sometimes going to actually adopt some issues that we have not as a country ourselves really gotten to a point of having shared understanding. And possibly because I'm a social scientist, it may never be possible that we can have shared understanding on an issue. But at least a convention gives us the broader principles that we should sign up to. In which case the principle here being we should be very unambiguous in saying no to gender-based violence, regardless of who it's happening to. And then we should also recognize, address, prevent, and also seek to ensure that violence against women and girls, just because they are women, just because they are girls, should also be outlawed. So these are some of the challenges that, as we say, we want to move forward with implementation. There are those that would want to say, no, my belief says that it is okay for me to discipline someone using violence. But we've also seen that using violence to address conflicts does not help.
One thing that I've noted, Mrs. Mwanigwa, is the fact that this thing is centered on women and girls. And yet we have stats that also tell us that men are also affected in this. Why is it really focusing on women and girls, and yet the other gender is also facing similar challenges?
The specific focus on women and girls is just in response to the statistics that tell us that the majority of those that are facing gender-based violence are women and girls. But this also does not mean that the violence that is faced by men and boys is ignored. Remember, violence against women and girls is a sub-part to the greater gender-based violence discussion. And that gender-based violence discussion is applicable to both men and boys. In this particular convention, what's important for us to think about is that we're looking also at men not just as a problem, much as, yes, the statistics show us that the majority that are perpetrating the violence are men. But we are not wanting to continue looking at just men as a problem, but to start to involve, to have male engagement so that men become part of the solution.
Correct.
They acknowledge the role that they play in this issue, and they also provide us with some of the solutions to addressing the issue.
Just to add more value to what you're saying, I'll probably ask you engagement of government in connecting, getting the word out there to schools, universities, and other education institutions to integrate GBV prevention and responses. Is that happening?
In principle, this convention belongs to government, because when we say member states, as member states, those who represent us at the AU is our government, and our government then is the responsible duty bearer for putting this out. And like I said initially, in Zimbabwe, the government has set up, or there is a national gender machinery, which brings together relevant ministries within government that are responsible for gender issues, that are responsible to also look at issues of gender-based violence, among other issues. And then these are working with other partners, other stakeholders, for us to be able to be more effective. So really, government is the one that is initiating the process and then working with stakeholders to actually increase its outreach. Having a national gender machinery means that we're able to come together with other institutions that are not specifically government to ensure that we pull together resources and we can then be more effective that way.
Correct.
And I'm speaking here as a person who's coming from an institution whose role is to monitor what government is doing as far as gender is concerned.
Strategies employed to reach marginalized and hard-to-reach communities?
I partly spoke to it, but I'll speak again and say the way the national gender machinery is organized is that it is working with civil society organizations. It's working with faith-based network organizations. So our churches that we know, churches are spread out across the country, right down to the local level. It's also working with the media. We have the media coming on board as part of this process. We also have the private sector coming on board to support with whatever resources they're able to support, and also to do their own work within the private sector, because when we talk about ending violence against women and girls, there are two sides to it. It's at an institutional level. We are saying ending violence against women and girls within the institution, but then also doing what you can to ensure that out there you support the process of ending violence against women and girls. So there is that national gender mission. However, let me not give an impression or clarify that this is not to give an impression that it's straightforward. It's hard work. There is some resistance, like I said earlier, and sometimes we find that even if we have resources, they are never enough to be able to address the problem in its totality.
Well said. Just as a summation, your last words to maybe the viewers and in particular, Zimbabwe and Africa.
To Zimbabwe, we already started. We have the legal framework, the legislative framework in place. We also set up the institutional framework to deal with the implementation of this convention on ending violence against women and girls. And we just now need to ensure that the cultural aspect is dealt with, that may actually militate against what the institutional framework, what the legislative framework says. To Africa, let's remain accountable as a continent, and that also applies even to Zimbabwe. We've done very well in adopting instruments to deal with some of the prevailing issues in our continent. We now need to show that what we are signing up to is what we believe in, by ensuring that we put enough resources for implementation.
Ms. Mwaniga, it was a pleasure having you on the show. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss here. I think we might have to bring you in next time. We'll discuss a bit further on this subject. That was your program, Focus 54. And of course, we had Mrs. Mwaniga just taking us through the paces of what transpired at the 38th African Union Summit and, of course, the adoption of the AU Convention. Until next time, it was a pleasure having you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Thank you very much.